Geopolitics Empire is joined by Dr. Francis Boyle, who is international law professor at the University of Illinois. We'll be discussing the Wuhan coronavirus and biological warfare. He's served as counsel to numerous governments, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Palestinian Authority. He's represented numerous national and international bodies in the areas of human rights, war crimes and genocide, nuclear policy, and biowarfare. He's written numerous books, one of my favorites being Destroying Libya and World Order, which I assigned as mandatory reading material for my own students when I taught at the Monterey Institute of Technology. But most important for this interview, he's written a book called Biowarfare and Terrorism and drafted the U.S. domestic implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention, known as the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989, that was approved unanimously by both houses of the U.S. Congress and signed into law by President Bush. And thanks for joining us, Dr. Boyle.
Wow, thank you so much for having me on, and thanks for that kind introduction.
Now, let's get to what's been on the news recently, this coronavirus in Wuhan. There have been some reports recently. There's a really interesting website called Great Game India that has been reporting on this. And they've been talking about China, which they say has been complying with Biological Weapons Convention in recent years. But then there are some people in the U.S. and experts that have been saying that in reality, China isn't complying with the Weapons Convention. And I think neither perhaps the U.S. As well. And, you know, I'm wondering if China is developing its own biosafety level for lab in Wuhan and elsewhere as, you know, as a type of deterrence. Is it a type of biological arms race that we have going on? You told me in an email that you suspect China was developing the coronavirus as a dual-use biowarfare weapons agent. And also, what do you make of reports that Chinese scientists have been stealing research and viruses, including the coronavirus, from a Canadian biolab this past December? And as well, Chinese nationals have been charged with smuggling vials of biological research to China from the U.S. With the aid of Charles Leiber, who was the chair of Harvard's chemistry department, and who also happened to be in 2011 a strategic scientist at Wuhan University. So can you tell us what's going on with this recent outbreak in Wuhan?
Right. Well, that's a lot of questions. I guess we can take them one at a time. But if you just do a very simple Google search on does China have a BSL-4 laboratory, Wuhan comes up right away. It's at the top of the list. That's all. The moment this type of thing happened, I began to do that. And so a BSL-4 is the most serious type. And basically, BSL-4 labs, we have many of them here in the United States, are used to develop offensive biological warfare weapons with DNA genetic engineering. So it does seem to me that the Wuhan BSL-4 is the source of the coronavirus. Yes. And my guess is that they were researching SARS and they weaponized it further by giving it gain of function properties, which means it could be more lethal. And indeed, the latest report now is its 15% fatality rate, which is more than SARS, and 83% infection rate. So typical gain of function, it travels in the air. So it could reach out maybe 6 feet or more from someone emitting a sneeze or a cough. Likewise, this is a specially designated WHO research lab. So the WHO is in on it, and they knew full well what was going on there. Yes, it's also been reported that Chinese scientists stole coronavirus materials from the Canadian lab at Winnipeg. Winnipeg is Canada's foremost center for research, developing, testing biological warfare weapons. It's along the lines of Fort Detrick here in the United States of America. And yeah, I have 3 degrees from Harvard. Would not surprise me if something was being stolen out of Harvard to turn over to China. I read that report. I don't know what was in those vials, one way or the other. But the bottom line is, my opinion is, and I drafted the U.S. domestic implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention that was approved unanimously by both houses of the United States Congress, signed into law by President Bush Sr., that it appears the coronavirus that we're dealing with here is an offensive biological warfare weapon that leaked out of that Wuhan BSL-4. I'm not saying it was done deliberately, but there have been previous reports of problems with that lab and things leaking out of it. And I'm afraid that is what we are dealing with today.
And so, can you give us? I mean, we'll be talking about the Wuhan and the coronavirus in China, but can you give us kind of like a bigger context? I know you've previously in interviews said that since 9/11, you think that the U.S. has spent $100 billion on biological warfare research. We know the Soviet Union, if I'm not mistaken, developed anthrax as a bioweapon. And you've also mentioned that UK, France, Israel, and China are all involved in biological warfare weapons research. So, and something interesting, I believe 1 or 2 years ago, a Bulgarian journalist and the Russian government shared their concern of the discovery of a U.S. bioweapons lab in Georgia, in the country of Georgia. You've commented how in Africa, U.S. has set up bioweapons labs to work on Ebola, which I think is illegal under international law, but they were allowed somehow to put those in Africa. So can you give us like a bigger picture, what's going on with these different countries and what's the purpose of this research?
All these BSL-4 labs are by, United States, Europe, Russia, China, Israel, are all there to research, develop, test biological warfare agents. There's really no legitimate scientific reason to have BSL-4 labs. And that figure I gave, 100 billion, that was about 2015, I believe. I had crunched the numbers and came up with that figure, the United States since 9/11. That, to give you an idea, that's as much in constant dollars as the U.S. spent to develop the Manhattan Project and the atom bomb. So it's clearly all weapons related. We have well over 13,000 alleged life scientists involved in research, development, testing biological weapons here in the United States. And actually, this goes back. It even precedes 9/11, 2001. I have another book, The Future of International Law and American Foreign Policy, tracing that all the way back to the Reagan administration under the influence of the neocons. And they got very heavily involved in research, development, testing of biological weapons with DNA genetic engineering. It was because of that that I issued my plea in 1985 at a congressional briefing sponsored by the Council for Responsible Genetics. I'm a lawyer for them. They're headquartered in Cambridge, Mass. All the MIT, Harvard people are involved in that, the principal ones. And then they asked me to draft that implementing legislation. So the implementing legislation that I drafted was originally designed to stop this type of work, death science work, I call it, by the United States government. And then after 9/11, 2001, it just completely accelerated. My current figure, that last figure, 100 billion, I haven't had a chance to recrunch the numbers because I just started classes, but you have to add in about another 5 billion per year. So basically, this is an offensive biological weapons race by the United States government, and it's been and with its assistance in Canada and Britain. And so other states of the world have responded accordingly. including Russia and China. They were going to set up a whole series of BSL-4 facilities as well, and Wuhan was the first, and it backfired on them.
So, I mean, would you basically consider what happened in Wuhan just boil it down to ineptitude or incompetence on the Chinese part?
Well, it's criminality. It does appear they stole something there from Winnipeg. This activity that they engaged in clearly violates the Biological Weapons Convention. Research development of biological weapons these days is an international crime. I mean, the use of it would be. And that was criminal. I'm not saying they, deliberately inflicted this on their own people, but it leaked out of there. And all these BSL-4 facilities leak. I mean, everyone knows that who studies this. So this was a catastrophe waiting to happen, and unfortunately, it happened. And the Chinese government under Xi and his comrades there have been covering this up from the get-go. The first reported case was December 1. So they've been sitting on this until they couldn't anymore. And everything they're telling you is a lie. It's propaganda. The WHO still refuses to declare a global health emergency. Its head, Tedros, was over there shaking hands with Xi and smiling and yucking it up. The WHO is in on it. They've approved many of these BSL-4 labs. They know exactly what's going on. And that is a WHO research-approved laboratory. So they know what's going on, too. So you can't really believe anything the WHO is telling you about this. Either they're up to their eyeballs in it, in my opinion.
I'd probably agree with you that this outbreak in Wuhan was, an accidental leak from the laboratory, but it's just your thoughts. I mean, it's happening at quite an opportune time because, namely, we're smack in the middle of a U.S.-China new Cold War, which is currently characterized by economic warfare, such as the trade war, among other forms of hybrid and technological warfare. And it seems the Wuhan outbreak will likely hit the Chinese economy hard. The Chinese are flat out dismissing any idea that the U.S. Is involved. And like I said, it's probably, they made mistakes in the Wuhan lab. But I mean, what are your thoughts if of any seemingly, this would benefit the U.S.?
When the outbreak occurred, of course, I considered that alternative too. You always have, when you have an outbreak, you're never quite sure who or what is behind it. It certainly isn't bats. I mean, that's ridiculous. They made the same argument on Ebola in West Africa. I demolished that online. You can check it out. So I kept competing theories about this. But right now, when you originally contacted me, I said I wasn't prepared to comment because I was weighing the evidence. I'm a law professor and a lawyer. I try to do the best I can to weigh the evidence. But right now, that Wuhan BSL-4, in my opinion, is the most likely source. Apply Occam's razor, the simplest explanation. I'm not ruling out, some type of sabotage, but right now, I believe that is the source here.
And you mentioned the WHO, and I'd like to just get your thoughts on the WHO and the big pharma. There's also some analysts who are downplaying this news media hype of the coronavirus. I mean, you've just said that it seems to be lethal, but if we go back a decade to the 2009 swine flu, which I believe didn't have too many casualties, but I think profited greatly the pharmaceutical companies. And if I recall that back in 2009, many countries purchased great stocks of the vaccines, and they ended up not using, anywhere from 50 to 80% of the vaccines that they purchased. You've previously stated that in an interview that the World Health Organization is a front for big pharma, if I'm not mistaken. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Also agrees, and he says 50% of WHO funding comes from pharmaceutical companies, and that the CDC itself is also severely compromised. So, what are your thoughts on the WHO, the CDC?
Yeah, can't trust anything the WHO says because they're all bought and paid for by big pharma. and they work in cahoots with the CDC, which is the United States government. They work in cahoots with Fort Detrick, so you can't trust anything. However, the swine flu, and yes, I agree, pharma made a lot of money, but that swine flu, which I looked at, it did seem to me to be a genetically modified biological warfare weapon. It was a chimera of 3 different types of genetic strains that someone put it together in a cocktail. Fortunately, it was not as lethal as all of us feared. So fine. But as I said, this figure I just gave to you was Saturday from Lancet, which is a medical publication, saying it's a 15% fatality rate and an 83% infection rate. So it's quite serious. I think far more serious than swine flu. As for big pharma, sure, they're all trying to profit off this today as we speak. There was a big article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, all big pharma trying to, peddle whatever they can over there in China, even if it's worthless and won't help. We do know that if you read the mainstream news media, they say there isn't a vaccine. Well, there is. It's the by the Pierbright Institute in Britain. That's tied into their biological warfare program over there. They were behind the hoof and mouth disease outbreak over there that wiped out their cattle herd, and it leaked out of there. So it was clear they're working on a hoof and mouth biological warfare weapon. But the vaccine is there. I have the patent for it here. I haven't had a chance to read the patent. It's about 25 pages long, and my classes just resumed. So eventually I get some free time. I'll read the patent. But you can't patent a vaccine with the United States Patent Office, unless the science is there. So there is a vaccine. Everyone's lying about that. No one's pointing this out. There's a vaccine, but instead, Big Pharma wants to make money, and the researchers say, well, it'll take 3 months, and we're racing for it. Everyone's going to make a buck off of this, that's for sure. But there is a vaccine. What they're telling, I have the patent here. I have not. It's been patented by the United States government. So obviously, I don't know exactly how workable it is, but it's a vaccine. I don't know why is it out there now. Why isn't someone saying there is a vaccine? Perhaps political leaders have already been vaccinated, for all I know. I really don't know, but there is a vaccine. Pierbright is well known there in Britain, and it's tied into Fort Detrick, and CDC is tied into Fort Detrick too. So they all know there's a patented vaccine.
And just to get your comment on, something to related to this, which was my next question. So I'm not sure if it's that same institute that you just mentioned that has the patent, but I read somewhere that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation maybe funds or has some connection to that institute that has the patent.
They do, yeah. And, the Bill and Melinda Gates information, they fund this type of DNA genetically engineered biological warfare work. That's correct. So you can't trust anything they're telling you that somehow they're out there trying to make the world a better place. We have Bill Gates publicly admitting the world would be a better place if there were a lot less people. So they're the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation. They are wolves in sheep's clothing. And they are funding this type of stuff, sure.
Well, and just your comment, there was also the report that I guess it was a consortium of companies, which included the Gates Foundation, that back in just 2-3 months ago, in October of 2019, they held a pandemic exercise simulating an outbreak. What are the chances specifically of a coronavirus? And I don't know if it was called Event 201. People can find this online, and they gave a list of 7 recommendations for governments and international organizations to take. I also find that kind of interesting how they had this simulation.
That's correct. It's raises that question, the origins of what happened here. But right now, I'm just looking at the evidence I have and applying Occam's razor. And we know that Wuhan BSL-4 was research developing, testing SARS as a biological warfare agent. So it could have been they gave it this DNA, genetic engineering enhanced properties, gain of function, which we do here in the West, in the United States, all the time. We have all sorts of research that is clearly biowarfare research that has been approved by the National Institutes of Health. It's a joke. They know full well they are approving offensive biological warfare research, and it gets funded by the United States government. Yeah.
And you've also mentioned in the email to me that what happened in the biosafety lab level 4 in Wuhan calls into question the safety of all of these level 3 and level 4 labs around the world. But aside from
they're completely unsafe. BSL-3 and BSL-4 labs are only designed for research, development, testing of offensive biological warfare agents. They have, in my opinion, they serve no legitimate purpose at all. They should all be shut down, every one of them. And even assuming they're simply they're too dangerous. If you want, there's a excellent documentary called Anthrax Wars by Nadler and Cohen. And I'm in there repeatedly. And at the end, I say, with respect to these labs, 3 and 4, this is a catastrophe waiting to happen. Well, I'm afraid the catastrophe has now happened. So there it is.
Yeah, I was just watching that documentary before we connected, and I recommend listeners go check that out. Do you see in the future any countries, if we come to a conflict between U.S., EU, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, Russia, you name it, do you see any of these countries actually utilizing these biological weapons it's illegal under international law, but we know, like in the past, that international law isn't followed. Do you think that there's a real danger of this escalating?
For sure. That's the only reason they develop these biological weapons is eventually to be used. Sure. It's like the Manhattan Project. We put all that money into developing an atom bomb. And even though it was not needed to end World War II, they still nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, yes, I think that's correct. And also, these can be used covertly. Anytime you see a unexplained sudden outbreak of a disease like this anywhere in the world, both for human beings or animals, I always suspect the biowarfare agent is at work, and I monitor the situation like I did at Wuhan until I can reach a conclusion. So, yes, they can be used. And as for the United States government today, they are fully prepared, armed, equipped, supplied to wage biological warfare with anthrax. These other more exotic things, I don't know, but they have the weapons, they're stockpiled, and we have to understand. If you read Seymour Martin Hersh's book, published about 1968, he won the Pulitzer Prize for Me Lie. He had the whole offensive U.S. biological warfare industry in there back before it was illegal, okay, and criminal. And basically, after 9/11, 2001, that entire industry, offensive biological warfare industry, has been reconstituted here in the United States with all these BSL-4, BSL-3 labs, well over 13,000 alleged scientists, sort of like Dr. Mengele, working on these things. And so other countries have responded in kind, like Russia, like China. Yes. France is involved. Britain's involved. Sure.
And you mentioned covert use. I just wanted to get your thoughts. In the last few years, there was the the Russian double agent spy Sergei, I forget it, Skripal, who had been allegedly poisoned with Novichok out in Britain. And I thought it was funny. It just so happened where he was allegedly poisoned, he was right near Porton Down, I guess the British bioweapons lab, I guess the world's first bioweapons lab that was created in 1916. I mean, I don't know if you have thoughts on that whole incident.
Right. Well, yeah, it was right down the street from Porton Down. So, applying Occam's razor, who do you think might have been behind this? And it was not a nerve agent. A nerve agent would have killed him immediately. This Novichok. It was something else like DX or something like that. So fine, but that I would just say that I don't think that was a coincidence. But there you go. Obviously, there's a lot of speculation on that.
And something else that's kind of interesting, you've written in Biowarfare and Terrorism, your book, and there's also Graham McQueen, I think your colleague, who wrote The Anthrax Deception, the Case for Domestic Conspiracy.
I agree with everything he said in there. That's correct.
And I'm wondering also if this new war for biotechnological dominance, whatever you want to call it, if it can also be used kind of as a pretext for the centralization of political power and the initiation of wars, like I guess it did in the 2003 Iraq War. I mean, is this another danger that we get these events like now this coronavirus, and then governments will call for centralization of greater power and taking away some of our civil liberties?
Sure. If you look at the October 2001 anthrax attacks here in the United States, that was clearly by elements of the United States government that was behind that. That was super weapons grade anthrax with 1 trillion spores per gram, and it floated in the air. So only a very sophisticated biological weapons lab like Fort Detrick could produce that. And they used that anthrax attack, including on Congress, to ram through the USA Patriot Act, which basically turned the United States into a police state, which is what we have now. So, yeah, and you have to understand the Pentagon, Fort Detrick, maybe Dugway Proving Ground still has a stockpile of that super weapons grade anthrax that we saw in October 2001 that they can use the next time they want to do something like that to further develop the American police state. Right.
Is there anything else you feel important to mention regarding this Wuhan coronavirus outbreak or biological warfare, or any other thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
Well, you just can't believe anything the Chinese government, the WHO, the CDC are telling you. They're all lying because they know what's going on here, and so you're going to have to figure it out as best as you can. But in my opinion, as of this time, and I'm fully prepared to consider further evidence on this, it does seem to me that this was a DNA genetically engineered biological warfare agent leaking out of Wuhan that has gain of function properties, which can make it more lethal. I think they're probably doing something with SARS to make it more lethal and more infectious. And so for that reason, you have to take extreme precautions. And they're now finally admitted, well, yeah, anyone within 6 feet can be infected, whereas with SARS, it was about 2 feet. Well, that's gain of function right there. And that should be a tip-off. So I guess you're going to have to protect yourself. Lori Garrett had a pretty good essay in Foreign Policy yesterday, and she was over there covering the SARS, and she has very good advice in there, except that she took the SARS figure of 2 to 3 feet and said, well, you got to stay 2 to 3. I think you got to stay at least 6 feet away because this is gain of function. It can float through the air and infect you, and it can get you in the eyes, any orifice, the mouth, maybe the ears. We're not sure at this point.
Yeah, I'm here on the border of China with in Kazakhstan, and I was just reading today, that they're no longer allowing Chinese citizens into Kazakhstan. I think without a medical, like a paper medical check to get their visas to enter Kazakhstan.
Those medical checks are worthless because this is just public relations by all the governments involved. Because there is a 14-day incubation period where people can still be infected. So someone could walk right through a medical inspection and pass it, get into your country, and then they come down with the coronavirus. So that's all public relations, in my opinion, by governments, and they know it. And they're just sending people out there with temperatures and things like that. It's not like SARS. This is more dangerous than SARS. As I said, I think that Wuhan lab, we know they had SARS in there that they were dealing with, and I think they enhanced it. And I'm afraid, that's what we're dealing with. But I'm keeping an open mind as to what other sources it might have, and I wasn't prepared to say anything until that Wuhan lab is right there, and it's dealing with coronavirus. So again, apply Occam's razor. It seems to me that's the simplest explanation here.
I guess one of my final questions would be, in the months ahead, apart, as you say, staying 6 feet away from people. I've read, taking high doses of vitamin C and other things like this can help you. But if they come out, as the situation develops, if it gets worse, and they come out with a coronavirus vaccine, what do you think should people take it or not? What are your thoughts?
Well, what I would say is this: right now, if you look at the article in the Wall Street Journal, Big Pharma is trying to sell all sorts of, they're taking all their drugs off the shelf and say, well, let's see if it works, which is preposterous. Okay. The scientists are saying, well, we can get you a vaccine, maybe 2 to 3 months, but they're not tested. So what we do know, however, is that Purebright vaccine has been patented. So all I can assume is that might work. But I don't think I'd be taking any of these other vaccines. No, you have no idea what's in there. You'll be the guinea pig for Big Pharma. And, everyone's figures they're going to make a lot of money here. So I'll keep my eye open on this and how it develops. But I wouldn't trust anything they're trying to sell right now. They're just pulling these things off the shelf. And, if they do come up with something 2 to 3 months, even that's not going to be tested, in accordance with normal scientific protocol. So it's going to be a crapshoot. If it's going to help you, and indeed it might not help you, because they'll be using for these vaccines, these DNA genetic engineered vaccines, they'll be using live coronavirus, probably, and sticking it in there and giving you some live coronavirus on the theory you'll develop an immunity. That's the way a lot of these vaccines work out. That's what happened with the Ebola vaccine that created the Ebola pandemic there in West Africa. They were testing out a vaccine on poor Black Africans, as usual, and this vaccine had live Ebola in it. So it gave them live Ebola. So I'd be very careful, even if they do come up with these vaccines 2 to 3 months from now. Very careful. Why would you want to inject live coronavirus into you?
All right. I don't believe you have a strong online presence. How can people best follow your work? I suppose to search for interviews as well as get your books.
Well, basically, I'm blackballed and blacklisted off all the mainstream news media here on purpose. As far as I can figure out, the U.S. government gave an order that I should not be interviewed by anyone. So I'm not. So I guess you could just put my name in there under Google, a Google alert, and some interviews might come up. But what happened was, right after the anthrax attacks of 9/11 2001, I was giving a lecture out at Harvard, my alma mater, and I was running a panel on biological warfare for the Council for Responsible Genetics. I'm their lawyer. And it was at Harvard Divinity School. And as I was going in, there was a Fox camera crew there from Boston. And I said, it looks to me like this has come out of the U.S. government lab. And we know they do research and develop testing on anthrax. Then I said the same thing there at Harvard. Then I gave an interview to a radio station in Washington, D.C. Then I gave an interview on that to the BBC, so the whole world saw it. And at that point, I was completely cut off, and I've been cut off ever since. So you're probably not going to hear too many interviews from me here. As for my book, Biowarfare and Terrorism, you can just get it at Amazon.com. That picks up the story pretty much from 9/11 2001 until it went to press. And then there are interviews I've given to an investigative reporter, Sherwood Ross, Sherwood Ross. And a big one I just sent you might want to put on your webpage that was pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, I read that as well. I'll include the link in the description of this interview so people can go check that out. And yeah, you're not the only academic. I know others and have heard of others that similar things have happened, and that's just, I guess, the price we pay for telling the truth. And so, again, for listeners, if people want to have a broader context and deeper understanding of what's happening today, especially with biological warfare, as well as U.S. foreign policy and international affairs, I urge you to get Dr. Francis Boyle's books and listen to his interviews, as well as his colleague's book, Graham McQueen, The Anthrax Deception, The Case for a Domestic Conspiracy. And thank you for being with us, Dr. Boyle.
Well, thank you. And again, please understand, these are my current opinions. I could change my opinion here based on more evidence. So I'm just looking at the evidence out there as I see it. And you have to understand, there is so much disinformation, lies, and propaganda that it's kind of very difficult to distinguish truth from fact. I'm doing the best job I can here.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast and interview. I would like to remind you that our website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and you can sign up for our mailing list that goes out each weekend with the latest podcast and a long collection of important news headlines. It's good to sign up for the newsletter in case we experience censorship and deplatforming. You can help the Geopolitics and Empire podcast by subscribing to and interacting with all of our channels such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Gab, Minds, and Steemit. You can also help us by leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platforms such as iTunes, Castbox, Stitcher, Spreaker, and so on. Finally, if you value our work and our mission and would like to see us continue interviewing experts from across the political spectrum, please consider leaving a one-time donation via PayPal or Bitcoin, or becoming a regular monthly supporter on our Patreon. All the links can be found on geopoliticsandempire.com. Thanks for listening.